Whenever I complete a game for the first time, there's always a fine line between whether I say, alright, that was fun, or,
wow. Let's do that again!
While it's obviously important to try out new things and have some variety in your life, sometimes there's nothing better than revisiting a game you already know you like. Whether it be hopping into your 50th online match of the day, revisiting a story that you found enjoyable, or simply wanting to master a combat system that you've grown to love, there are countless reasons to replay the games we like. But despite this, I feel like the topic of replay value has become kind of a heated discussion over time. For example, dude, how could you even consider the idea that Sekiro is as replayable as Skyrim? Skyrim has tons of different weapons, spells, characters, quests, and just way more content to come back for. Sekiro is significantly shorter, and you only use one main weapon for the entire game. That's so boring. But bro, Sekiro is a way more tight experience. The game is short because it's focused, and is almost always giving you exactly what you came for. How could you possibly argue that walking through the same open landscapes and going through the motions of the same character interactions can come close to the feeling that you get when you finally beat Ishin without taking a single hit? These are just a couple of the countless arguments I've witnessed from people thinking that replay value is a concrete aspect of a game. And while it admittedly is in some ways, the reality is that replay value is often about as subjective as food. If you liked what you got, then you'll probably want to come back for more. So today, I'd like to dive into the vast world of different ways that games hold people's attention past the first playthrough, as well as what I think are the two different types of replay value. While many games can potentially fit into both categories, every title has its own unique hook for bringing the player back, and I think they should be more equally respected. So with that said, let's start by talking about the more set-in-stone type of replay value. To me, artificial replay value refers to when a game goes out of its way to have features that are inherently designed to lure you back to them. Off the top of my head, the most common example I could think of is collectibles. I'm personally not a huge achievement hunter myself, but I know that a lot of people often go into new games with the mindset of wanting to find everything and already fiending for that platinum trophy. Obviously, some games handle this aspect better than others, and there are a few that can even be a bit infamous for the tediousness that comes from finding everything. But in general, it's a decent idea. Wanting to find all the different cool shit throughout the game and be able to say that you've seen everything it has to offer is a nice way of keeping people's attention past the first playthrough. Another commonly used method of making a game seem inherently replayable is by making it non-linear. I don't mean any offense to linear games when I say this. There are a ton that I love and think have good replay value. But the reason why non-linear games have such an edge for pulling you back in is because it feels so refreshing to have multiple ways to achieve the same goal. The main thing that comes to mind here would obviously be open world games. The whole appeal of a lot of them is the fact that you can practically do whatever the hell you want, meaning that it's almost impossible for a second playthrough to be similar to the first. Focus on the main story when it sounds fun, take some time to level up and play it safe by completing side missions, or just say screw all that and mess around with your friends for hours. But of course, the most commonly praised form of non-linearity comes from Metroidvanias. Games that don't have the same level of freedom as an open world, but always have more than one way of progressing. Metroidvanias, or even games inspired by Metroidvanias, are usually associated with having really solid replay value, because after you've seen the different ways that the map loops around and connects different areas, then you already know where to find useful items or power-ups and can give yourself a huge advantage on subsequent playthroughs. But non-linearity can even come from something as simple as the level design in the first Halo game. In general, this is a pretty linear game, but it has two levels that allow you to choose which objectives you'd like to complete first, or even skip a few steps if you already know what you're doing, which is awesome. And of course, non-linear storytelling is a whole different beast. Forcing the player to make choices on the spot that directly affect the outcome of the narrative is a perfect way of utilizing the medium of games. And naturally, it does a great job at giving the player an incentive to revisit it. Lots of games have a multitude of different endings, where if you make the wrong choices, you'll end up with a hella messed up bad ending. But if you want, you can replay the game and try to do everything perfectly so that you get the best possible scenario. I have so much respect for developers that do this kind of thing, because it takes balls to risk a fair amount of your player base being upset with the ending they got, all for the sake of immersion. Some games like Undertale even give the story an entirely different feel based on your actions, where you're given completely unique, surprisingly well thought out scenarios and boss fights that you wouldn't even know existed if you went with a different playstyle. And speaking of playstyles, another super effective way to make a game replayable when it comes to combat-focused titles is giving the player a wide variety of builds. Whether it be a vast number of weapons and spells to try out in an RPG, all the different creatures you can train to battle for you in a Pokemon game, or the endless supply of personas to fight with in a Persona game, giving the player a massive sandbox of tools and weapons to try out can almost make it feel like you're playing a different game on replay, as long as you're always willing to give the varying strategies a shot. But what if the developers decided to give the player so much freedom to the point that they practically make the game themselves? Super Mario Maker and Black Ops 3 Custom Zombies are just a couple of great examples of the fact that giving gamers the liberty of messing around with the systems they've grown accustomed to, and letting their imagination run wild, can lead to some of the most endlessly replayable content on the market. As long as people who are passionate about the games stay motivated to keep creating their own wacky levels, then you've essentially got a non-stop stream of content. But of course, I think I've gone long enough without mentioning possibly the single biggest hook in all of gaming: multiplayer. Having the ability to play games with your friends, or just any randoms online, and continuously strive to get better at what you're playing to show off your skills can lead to an infinite loop of fun. Whether it be first-person shooters, 2D fighting games, online RPGs, or just some chill co-op survival, the appeal of multiplayer is so strong, to the point that these days, a lot of people don't even consider playing single-player titles anymore. Because the continuously evolving and relevant world of multiplayer is such an effective gimmick that it can almost make single-player games feel pointless in comparison. There's a reason why the majority of the most popular games on Steam are multiplayer focused, and that's probably never gonna change. As long as the developers make enough updates to keep their 11-year-old games relevant, they'll always be there to dominate the market, for better or worse. And before moving on, let's wrap up this section by talking about procedurally generated content. The idea that a game automatically creates its own levels, meaning that, in theory, there's an infinite amount of content leading to infinite replay value. But whether that's the case is really up to the player. Many games have attempted this strategy, with some being a lot more successful than others. But at the end of the day, it's really just a vehicle to give the player endless opportunities for fun. If you like the gameplay loop, then procedurally generated content might work really well for you, but if you're not into it, then it can come across as really shallow. Overall, there are countless methods for games to bring the players back to them, but whether each method is good or bad is up to the player to decide. Some find multiplayer to be super gripping, but also don't give a shit about completing a game's different endings. Others want to see every possible nook and cranny of their favorite narrative, but would rather watch an entire season of Velma than try to acquire all of the game's achievements. So with that said, let's talk about when games go less out of their way to achieve replay value. Natural replay value is when a game is able to draw you back to it without being inherently designed for multiple playthroughs. Titles with a big emphasis on this type tend to get the most shit from people who think replay value is a set-in-stone aspect of a game. Someone could go on and on arguing about how Journey has zero replay value. It's really short, and there are almost no methods to experience it in a different way than you did the first time around. But I've replayed it, just because I think it looks really cool. Sometimes games don't need endless amounts of builds, filler content, or collectibles in order to keep you coming back for more. If you really enjoy it, then sometimes it's nice to simply go through the motions again. One of the most common types of games found here are the ones that have a large large emphasis placed on linear story. Portal 1 and 2 both have gameplay that focuses on puzzle solving, meaning that once you beat them and already know how to solve the puzzles, they've essentially lost their gameplay hook for any subsequent playthroughs, unless you wait long enough to the point that you forget the solutions. But I've played both of these games a fair amount of times despite remembering the puzzles, and the reason I come back is because I just find the story and atmosphere to be so enjoyable that it's worthy of bringing me back for another playthrough. If you compared Resident Evil 2 Remake to 4 Remake, 4 would probably seem like the winner in terms of replay value. Sure, 2 has its alternate characters and scenarios, but 4 comes loaded with a shit ton of different weapons to try out, fun bosses to fight, and the larger emphasis on combat means that it has a nice system for players to strive to get better at. But personally, I've played through 2 Remake way more times, just because I think it nails the zombie horror atmosphere so damn perfectly. And while it's never going to have that same allure and scariness factor that it did the first time around, just getting a taste of that feeling is enough to encourage me to give it another go. Same goes for the Little Nightmares games. Not much about them changes on replay, and they'll never seem as creepy as they were the first time, but diving back into that weird, twisted world is something that no other game can replicate. Though of course, having a good story or atmosphere isn't the only way to make simple games replayable. Think of some of the most played games of all time, like Super Mario. Sure, these days the games have evolved into becoming a lot more complex than they once were, but even the ones created back in the 80s still have massive fan bases because they managed to find a gameplay loop that keeps people coming back again and again, which is all you need sometimes. If you've got someone hooked on a formula, then they can continue replaying it as long as they have the desire to jump back in and learn to get better at it. Speaking of which, let's talk about Sekiro. While this game does have a few aspects of artificial replay value, such as different endings, unique outfits, and a variety of tools or special moves you may have missed out on, the main reason I replay this game is because of the endless desire I have to master the combat. Out of all the From Software games, this one is infamous for becoming a lot easier on replay, because once you get the deflect timings down and manage to trudge your way through that first difficult playthrough, it's all just about memorization, and taking an experience that once beat the shit out of you at every turn into a breeze where you rarely even lose health is one of the most satisfying things I've felt in any game. While I think Sekiro is the absolute epitome of this concept from what I've seen, it also translates to tons of other difficult games. Ultimately, a lot of games that aren't particularly designed to be replayed manage to bring people back due to the notion of simply wanting to get better at it. Lots of people find the repetitive layouts in the second half of Halo CE to be boring and repetitive, making it an absolute slog to come back to. But because I think the combat of the game on Legendary difficulty is so endlessly fun and rewarding, I've played it countless times. When I initially completed Dark Souls 3, which was my first of the Souls games, there wasn't even a second thought as to whether I'd be playing it again. I hopped straight into New Game Plus with no regrets, not because of all the different builds or secrets that the game has to offer, but simply due to how much I grew to love the combat and wanted to get better at it. Naturally, this leads into the gargantuan world of challenge runs and speed running. While single-player games will never have the same level of enticement as multiplayer when it comes to showing off your skills, people will always continue to find new ways to test their abilities or set higher standards for themselves to live up to, which not only helps to keep a game interesting, but also makes for some pretty entertaining content. This idea also applies to systems that are more based around player expression, like the ones found in Devil May Cry or Hi-Fi Rush. Like, sure, there are different difficulties to try out and arena modes, but the main reason why I replay the Devil May Cry games is because of the never-ending allure to cook up some cool, unique combos. Seeing how long you can keep an enemy in the air while simultaneously trying to use as many different moves as possible can lead to an endless cycle of fun and experimentation. All in all, I think that games with a large emphasis on natural replay value are solid evidence of the fact that there is no real standard for what makes a game replayable. Developers can try as hard as they'd like to conjure up a million reasons for why you should come back, but a lot of the time it really just comes down to whether or not the player enjoys the gameplay. So as I've said before, I really don't think that replay value is as straightforward as a lot of people make it out to be. Sure, there are plenty of games that try their best to cook up a never-ending list of reasons to return to them, which certainly isn't a bad route to take. But there are also a fair amount which don't give a shit if you come back, yet still have massive fan bases who play them all the time. And of course, replay value shouldn't have to be a deciding factor on how much we like a game. It definitely adds value to it, but it's not like we always have to associate our favorite games with being the ones we've played the most. God of War Ragnarok is my favorite God of War game, but I've only beaten it twice, whereas I've gone through every game in the original trilogy a minimum of 5 times each, because I personally just find them to be more swiftly replayable and less bogged down with long, unskippable cutscenes. There are also a lot of people who don't even like the idea of replaying their favorite games, because they'd rather just be satisfied with their awesome first playthrough instead of making it feel less special by going through the motions over and over. While I've personally never been fully on board with this sentiment, it obviously makes sense. At the end of the day, replay value is whatever the hell we want it to be. If you feel like endlessly playing Halo 2 Anniversary just so you can keep looking at Sergeant Johnson with the best possible graphics, then you do you, man. And I'll keep playing the FromSoft games until the day I die, because I for some reason still haven't gotten bored of them. I think these games might have made me insane. Well, I always try to play new stuff whenever possible, since it's good to expand my horizons, but like, damn. Fighting Ishin again sounds kinda fun right now, not gonna lie.